Hello, everyone. Redcoat here. I've got Sienter and Dusty with me, and we're continuing the Highway to the Moon sets. And specifically today's topic, tool-based design, or rather, tool-based development. There's a slight difference between the two of those, but it's...
Design of tools for tool-based development.
Yeah, that makes sense. I'd say that's about good. So with that in mind, the first statement is so when you're building a system, why build tools?
First, you have to say what tool is, so I'll go ahead and define it. A tool is a piece of software that is used to do stuff for the game development. For example, one of our important tools was the enemy editor, which allowed us to edit files for making enemies. Many other things as well. We had a trend with the tools on Highway to the Moon.
Yeah, everything had a name,
And then quickly got out of hand into other parts of the program.
Yeah. They all did the thing that their name was about, but usually that was limited compared to what the full scope of the program was.
I would say that most of them ended up being 25%, 25 to 30% of whatever their name was, and then it was four other things that were all really kind of 10 to 15% of the tool. So it might have been the largest thing that tool did.
Yeah, I'd say that's about right. If anything, most of our tools were technically multi-tools because they just had all sorts of other functionalities interred within them that really didn't have any business being interred there. But
hey, that's just about the road script and the UI editor.
Yeah, well, we only had 4. What was it? No, well, technically we only had 3.
So we had in the end 3 main tools: the enemy editor, the road scriptor, and the UI editor. Those are what they were called. Now, what they did, the enemy editor did in fact allow you to edit enemies, but also sort of defined what a graphics file looked like. Not the visual appearance of it, but the way that it would, what the sprite sheet breakdown would look like, how quickly it animated, that sort of thing, how big it was in the game, as well as a collection of those into physics and objects and the physics on them and sprites, which is a collection of graphics. The AI, which was a huge part of it, which I'm sure we'll talk about shortly.
Oh, yeah.
And then weapons, power-ups, things like that.
Yeah.
The road scriptor did in fact allow you to write the scripts for the road, but it also lets you draw the graphics for the road, define the physics for a road, some other details about the road, like parallax layers, things like that, and also randomly contained the player sprite editor.
Yeah, I remember that now. Yeah, back then it didn't seem so weird. It just seemed like it was one of the evolution of the program.
It made perfect sense because the original design of the road scriptor required you to assign the player sprite based upon the level. So theoretically, you'd play level 1 as this player, and then level 2 as this player, and then level 3 as this player.
And then that became something that could be defined elsewhere.
Yes.
But we just didn't want to move all the tooling from one executable to another.
There's no reason to move the player sprite editor, so it just stayed in the road scriptor. The UI editor also contains support not only for UI stuff, which it does, UI screens, HUDs, elements, those sorts of things, but also defines stuff like the special options, which is used for something called the reality alternator, which allows you to dynamically change aspects of how the game plays. Well, dynamically is a little strong. It lets you set it before each play session.
Like sliders for things like enemy drop rates, stuff like that.
Well, yeah,
those are the simple ones. There's a lot more
of them are toggles.
Yeah.
A lot of them are actually toggles, but it allows you to adjust various properties of the game. So you can kind of dynamically craft your own difficulty level about what you want for that. It also defined the achievements list. It defined also the master file, which is a very important file. One of the things that happens when you're making a tool-centered design like this is you have to have some way of telling the game what is its data. So there are different ways of doing this. You could, for example, use like a WAD, like what Doom uses, where it's just like, hey, I'm looking for WADs within this directory, and oh, here's a bunch of WADs, we'll load these ones. Or you can use a specific file name, like what StarCraft, for example, does, the original one. I don't know what the second one has done, but the original one looked specifically at patch_rt.mpq to load up patch information. So, changes to unit properties and things like that. What the master file was for Highway to the Moon was it was the file that told the game engine what the stuff was. What did it need? What did it use? And it did this mostly by how things linked up. So basically, the game engine says, okay, I have the master file called masterfile.hal. All of them are called that because that's what the name it was looking for was. And then that would tell it things like, here is the reticle that you give the player for doing things like using menus and attacking or whatever. What are the sound effects you play when the player dies? What are the properties of the different playable characters? And then what is the main menu? Which is kind of important because then the game's like, okay, I load up the main menu. When I start the game, I load up these. This is the initial UI screen that I load, so I know the file name that I then need to load. So it's the point of entry for the whole system. And so that was a very important file. It defined a lot of stuff and basically controlled the game. And that was in the UI editor because...
it was there because, well, where else was it going to be? Well, it could have been in the road scriptor or the enemy editor, but it was there. It was there.
There were potentially more logically named tools for it to exist in.
Technically, we probably should have just created a singular suite and then just built things out of it. But as it was, we had different people working on different things, and so different people just built different EXEs and worked from there.
And different stuff came up at different times also. There were a couple of other random utilities. The dialogue bubble maker, which was used for making dialogue bubbles. That way I didn't have to sit there watching Redcoat stitch them together painstakingly in Paint.net.
It was a very, very meticulous process.
Yeah. There was the physics collision checkbox thing that basically said these types can collide with these types. That was a highly specialty program.
Mm-hmm.
There's the modulizer, which was used to compile the game into a singular file. A campaign file is what we called them.
And then there was the... what was it? It was the animation scriptor? What was that thing called?
Well, there's the sprite sheeter.
The sprite sheeter.
Which was for making sprite sheets out of individual frames. There was... I feel like there was some other random program, but it's eluding me. But there's a bunch of other sort of smaller utilities that got used every now and then. But the workhorse ones were definitely the enemy editor, the road scriptor, and the UI editor.
Which makes a lot of sense when you're making a shmup. All you've really got is the ground underneath you, your enemies, and the UI upon which you're going to play, and whatever particular systems that your character has to interact with the world. That's really all there is. Everything else is incidental.
Yeah. But yeah, thinking about all of these, because you've gone over a few of the portions, you went over the master file in pretty big detail here.
Mm-hmm.
And I think some of the cooler things that showed up in the tools, like on the enemy editor, I feel like the AI development there was that was one of the strongest points of those tools.
It was also one of the strongest points. CNTR is the one that did most of the AI backend and AI tooling. It was also probably one of the best points in the actual engine itself was the way all the AI was built.
Yeah, I'm very pleased with how the AI system came together. So a little bit of additional backstory. Some of the goals with making tools is to allow non-programmers to make the game.
Yeah, i.e. Redcoats.
Yeah, people like Redcoat, but also other people that came on and worked on it. And the point of the AI editing section of the enemy editor was to allow non-programmers to make AI and have a lot of customization power there. So it ended up being a very modular system, made it very easy to add stuff to it, and it was a fortunate design in many ways. It's similar to, in concept, the StarCraft Brood War trigger editor for anybody who's used that. The basic idea is that you define a condition that causes it to trigger, and then when it triggers, what it does when it triggers. So, for example, you could say, hey, when I have reached, say, less than this amount of health, or I've gotten to this location, do this thing, or this set of things. And so chaining those together allowed you to be able to make fairly complicated AI. And then AI was tacked on to a lot of things, because anything that was basically an enemy could have it. And bullets were a variant on enemies, so that meant our bullets could have AI, which meant they could do things like give themselves a gun and start shooting.
Yeah, basically anything that moved could be moved and wasn't the road itself. or could, interact with the world had AI in some form.
The player being the exception to that.
Oh, I mean, if you include the fact that if you include his guns, the guns they're not quite AI. They were the gun editor.
The bullets do have AI,
but
though.
the bullets have AI. So
Yeah.
anything that was made, anything that interacted,
Technically, you could actually add a component to the player to give him AI.
it just would be really obnoxious because the player couldn't do anything.
It depends upon
you
what it
could
did.
because you.
They'd be fighting against each other.
Yeah.
So I remember an experimental weapon that I made where an AI would be tacked onto the player that forced the player to move left.
Yes, that was
terrible.
It was
awful.
For there was a particular attack that it was a workaround to allow enemies to push the player. We ended up scrapping that.
It's absolutely
it played
obnoxious.
poorly. It was obnoxious, but we could do it, which was kind of the cool thing. And there's a lot of power in that system, so that's something that I'm very pleased by. And as Dusty was alluding to, the engine side of that was something that I'm particularly pleased with as well. It's a neat piece of programming. That system ended up serving us very, very well on this.
Yeah, and I mean there were a lot of interesting things with working with that system. I know as a designer I learned a lot of lessons just working on it, partially in the sense of actually talking to your programmers, because I was not used to. Well, first off, I wasn't used to being able to speak and then be listened to. It was a very different situation, because I was coming out of doing a lot of testing work, and before that, all of my teamwork with like student teams and such. It was a very different situation where it's like, you could ask for something, but what were the time constraints? What could you actually ask for? In this situation, it was more the idea of not so much that the sky is the limit. I mean, you still have certain things that you shouldn't ask for, where it's just like, that's a huge undertaking. But you at least have that situation where you can say, okay, this is really bugging me about how to do this. This is really slowing down my ability to make things happen. And then you voice that, and the programmer's like, well, actually, we already have something in here for doing that. I just didn't flip the switch. Do you want me to flip the switch? It's like, oh, well, sure.
Yeah, I remember Dragon Coder and I having to spend a bit of time training Redcoat on, we're right here, man. We're right here.
Yeah.
You can ask.
Turns out the big difference between being in a large group with hundreds of people and a small group with 4 people is when you have 4 people on the team, you can walk up to one of them and say, hey, Bob, do this thing! And they'll generally do it, or at least they'll tell you why they can't.
Yes.
Yeah.
But you need to tell them.
Yeah. I remember there's one poignant memory related to this that I have that is a good lesson for anybody making a tool or some other interface. And I remember I was adding an aspect to the AI editor that allowed you to be able to add favorited actions, because it turned out we had something in the end like 100 to 200 actions.
Roundabout, yeah.
I think it was over 150 different actions. It was some ridiculously huge number. And the problem with that is you have certain actions you're using all the time and trying to sort through that list to find the specific one that you want. Like, you could start typing in the name, but even then...
But nobody remembers the name.
Right. Like, that was part of it, right? Because often people would be like, hey, I want to do thing X. And it's like, yeah, it's called Y. But anyway, I added a favorites list where you could put your favorited actions, so that way you could be like, okay, I just click on this button and there is multiple actions, for example, which should have been the default behavior, but that was another early mistake. It always shocks me when I look at the code and see just how late that was added, relatively speaking.
Turns out, in AI, you're always going to do X and Y. You're never just going to do X and stop.
Yeah.
It never happens.
Very rarely. Anyway, so I was going through and adding the dialogue for putting things on the list or taking things off. And so I'm a shortcuts kind of guy. I use shortcut keys a lot. So I had set it up to be a couple of shortcut keys that you hit to take things on or off. And so I was like, okay, done. Get it distributed to everybody. And I watched Redcoat furiously mashing his mouse trying to get items to move over. And I'm like, oh, huh. And then I took a little bit of a look at things. I'm like, okay, double click, actually pretty easy to do. And still getting a feel for the full capacity of C# at the time. So I added that, and suddenly it worked in the way that Redcoat expected it to, and it made life a lot easier for him.
Yeah, there were many moments like that where it's just like doing a thing, and Like, I was always used to the idea of like, well, this is the thing I have, so I just need to make this work, right? I'll just figure out how to make this work, and then I'll just go with it that way. But it would be like, I'd be doing that, and then invariably, Ciantier or Dragon Coder would show up and be like, dude, you don't have to do that. It's like, there's a better way. Or rather, or even
We'll fix it.
Yeah, it's like, that, you shouldn't have to do that. Hold on. Just give me a couple hours. I'll get this fixed. Or they'd say, give me a day, and then an hour later it'd be done. I was like...
I was on the sidelines for most of the tooling part of this. I did the back end for graphics and so forth, and then went on to do financial stuff. But I just remember a lot of these things distinctly. And so, advice for anyone out there, if you're a producer or if you're a developer and you want your coder to make something for your tool, tell them. If you're a coder and you've made something, you've added things to tools, you should probably at least once a week go stand behind your developer and watch them try to use your tool without talking. Don't give them suggestions, just watch them and make notes.
Yeah.
Because there's a lot of terrible things that can go on.
There's a lot of other little improvements that came about in the programs because I was the one having to use them. So it turns out using a program is very different from designing one. And when you've started using it, you realize where your design was wrong. So there's a lot of changes that came about that way. I think one of Redcoat's particular joys was color.
Yes, that was a fun one. So, because originally it was all gray. Everything was gray. So you'd be like, okay.
For the AI editing.
Yeah, so for any boss character, for instance, you'd have... Bosses weren't necessarily created of just like one specific node of AI. They'd have like several different parts that all interact with each other, and then they'd have to call each other. And so they'd actually be embedded within each other, in like windows within windows, like seven layers deep.
Like the most basic boss in the game spanned like 2 pages, like written pages worth of things that just say multiple action X and Y, multiple action Q then Z, multiple action Z then X plus Y, then da 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 da, just going on forever because it's something moving around the screen, tracking the player, firing bullets. Those bullets had their own AI that would do their own thing. Most of them fired straight, but he also had missiles that turned, so they have their own AI. He would inevitably hit 50% HP and flip to a different AI. All sorts of crazy stuff on the AI, and all of it was in these big gray windows that were embedded within each other.
And so that meant that going from one piece to another, you couldn't really tell which one was which unless you counted, and then you'd lose count.
And even if you could count, and even if you did count, after 3 hours of doing it, you just look at it, and it just all blurs together, and you have no idea what's going on.
One of the biggest culprits for this was probably choose one at random.
Yes.
Oh, dear
Because
God.
you choose one at random, and then each random choice was a multiple action. So it's like, which set of actions am I taking? And then inside those multiple actions might be choose one at random again.
Yeah, so you'd have something like choose one at random, and then it would say you move to 4 corners. It would be multiple action, move to top right hand corner and choose one at random, fire at player, or move to one of the corners. You're only 3 layers deep.
I was doing this and I was looking at these things and I
Bleeding
forget
his eyes out.
Yeah, and my eyes were basically bleeding. But I was like, oh, I could do this. And then Santa shows up and is like, hold on, dude, don't, please. Let me have at this.
Yeah, I don't remember exactly how it came about or how much warning you had that the change was coming.
Well, I remember when you were doing it because you basically started helping work on the AI for level 2. The second boss, if I remember correctly. You helped with the AI on that, and when you did, you were just like, I cannot use this. No.
I can't tell what belongs to what. Yeah, because that would have been before the redesign to how AI movement patterns worked, which they were originally designed with the idea that you could give them to an enemy and then they'd follow it on their way down the screen, right? Because I was thinking standard issue shmup, an enemy spawns here, and then so it's a bunch of effectively movement vectors, which are basically little pointed arrows that say you go this far this way, and then you go this far this way. And the idea was you could just stick them on a bunch of enemies, and so if you had a bunch of enemies with the same AI movement pattern all lined up, they'd move in sync.
Yeah.
And that was not used. And then I made it so that way the AI movement patterns sent things to specific corners, and all of a sudden they were used all the time. So when it turned to world coordinates instead of vectors, that's when AI movement patterns started getting used. And I made that change because that's what would actually be useful. And everybody is doing these very complicated, like, go to this location. Okay, when you get to that location, now do this thing or this thing or this thing. So it'd be like, you get to this location. Okay, once you get there, choose one at random. Here's 5 different attack patterns to do from that location. Okay, after you've done that, choose one at random, one of the other 3 corners to go to.
Yeah, it was a complex process. But yeah, back on the subject. So the change that was made was just adding color and sequencing those colors with the groups that they were related to. So like if you had a choose one at random and that had several options inside of it, each of those options would be a different shade of the master color of that choose at random.
Right. So, for example, the choose one at random might be orange, and so it's got a solid orange for the first option, a paler orange for the next one, and then an even paler orange for the third one, and then cycle back to the deeper orange.
And that's like a quality of life change. Like that's not necessarily it did help with functionality, but not in the sense of making the program more efficient. It made the use of the program more efficient.
There's another related story with the Road Scriptor with the graphics editing tab. It basically uses a tile-based system, not strictly enforced. You don't have to put tiles in specific spots, but there's a grid, and if you don't use it, I don't know why. But anyway, the original setup was stuff kind of snapped into it awkwardly, and then eventually we got it so you could hold down Control to have stuff snap into place, so that way stuff would be there. But we had some friends come along to help design some levels, and they discovered a way that they could hold down a couple of buttons to effectively do what they called painting, which is where it would just keep making tiles over and over again. The problem was every single little bit of movement to the mouse would cause it to make another tile, so they would like draw 4 tiles and get like a 4,000 tiles, which is clearly terrible.
Yeah.
And to cause the Road Scriptor, when you told it, hey, build the physics for the level, it went, no!
That's if you could even do anything after it crashed. So
How many boxes do you want? 27 million? No.
Yeah, right. So I ended up rejiggering it so that way there was an actual paint mode that worked the way it should. But speaking of physics, that was one of the other crown jewels of the tools.
Yeah, that was I was so happy when that thing got made.
Yeah, it was early. Dragon Coder made the base of the Road Scriptor, particularly the graphics tab. He learned some lessons there. Probably should not learn to program C# by making an important tool, but that's what he did.
Turns out your first C# program probably should not involve, making large graphical objects out of smaller graphical objects.
For his credit, it worked. But anyway, I worked on the physics tab for that, and the idea being that this would allow the player to define physics. So, as you may recall, we said that this game takes place on a road that goes to the moon. And to have the road be meaningful, you have to be able to fall off the road. So our solution for this was hitboxes not on the road. So if you hit one of these hitboxes that was off the road, you would fall off the road and have that whole effect play, which would put you back on the road and take a chunk of your health. So the physics tab, I ended up deciding, I don't even remember why, but I ended up deciding to implement an algorithm that would automatically calculate physics boxes based upon the tiles that were placed in the graphics tab. This saved countless hours, as in I don't even know how to begin to try to count them.
Well, basically what it did was allowed all of the designers on the game to build their roads about 8 times longer.
Yeah,
and
probably.
Way more complicated without having to then also spend 16, 20 hours putting in hitboxes for those roads. And then, I forgot the hitbox in that middle of the road. And now people could go over that, pothole and not get killed.
Be like, I need to adjust this section of the level. I guess I have to go adjust the physics. Nope, just hit the calc button. Keep the slider to allow you to see individual steps all the way down so you don't see individual steps.
Yes, because if you see individual steps, there's a couple hundred, like more than a couple 200 of those happening.
So I remember Dragon Coder, I don't know why he made this, but he basically had this level that he made that was completely misaligned, unaligned tiles, and I had that to work with. So it ended up being a pretty solid, reliable algorithm for anybody making a road in a sane way. And So the process is actually pretty interesting. It goes through and it basically figures out where there are not row tiles, makes boxes, and then figures out what boxes it can combine into bigger ones. So it's a two-stage process. But that was kind of, that and the AI system are, in my mind, the two real crown jewels.
Yeah, definitely. Those were the two most used systems, and the AI system in particular I spent many an hour just staring at, just working with. And the physics button was
kept you from spending many hours staring at that tab.
Yeah, it's basically one of them is great because of the amount of time. It saved a lot of time, but specifically the amount of time that could be spent working with it because of all of the functionality it had. And the other one was great because of the amount of time that didn't need to be spent working with it, because it was really just as simple as push a button, you're done.
A lot of tools that people make, they make tools to be used, which isn't necessarily the correct idea. The tool isn't made to be used. The tool is made to make things as efficient as possible.
Yeah.
Sometimes this is because it being efficient makes it more usable, and it needs to be used all the time. And sometimes the tool needs to be made more efficient by just removing the user interface, because the user doesn't need to do this. They shouldn't need to do this. That's the point of that tool.
Like, technically you could add boxes and you needed to for diagonals, but it saved you the bulk of the work.
Yeah.
But anyway, I think that's probably enough about the tools.
Yeah, I'd say we've covered this one pretty well.
Yeah, I wasn't there for most of it, so I don't have anything else to put.
You brought the fun. You brought the fun.
It kept us alive.
Yep.
But yeah, so I'm going to go ahead and bring us to the sign-off here real quick, but just to let you know, our next spot's going to be about the gameplay and the general design of the game. And I'm probably going to be talking a lot during that one.
I'm probably just going to be making pot shots from the side.
Yep.
So we're going to go ahead and sign off here.
Ciantier, signing off.
Dusty, signing off.
And this is Redcoat, signing off. Play the games you want to play, boyos.